Hello friend, this is the second lecture of Indian Polity, and in this lecture we will learn about pre-independence governance. The Britishers ruled India for almost 200 years, from 1765 to 1947. In 1764, after the Battle of Buxar, East India Company got the Diwani right of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha region. This was the start of British governance in the Indian continent. There is a uh, term named laissez-faire. It is French word and its meaning free economy. No government interference in economy field, and it is related to Charter Act 1833. I gave the term here, but when we will learn Charter Act 1833, we will see what is the significance of this word. Regarding British governance, they ruled from 1765 to 1947, and the governance is divided into two era. One is East India Company rule, when a private company of England ruled Indian territory, and the second era was British government rule, when the British government directly ruled Indian territory. So first was East India Company rule from 1765 to 1858. During this time period, British Parliament introduced a number of act to control the East India Company. First was Regulating Act 1773, then Act of Settlement 1781, then third was Pitt's India Act 1784, then Act of 1786, Charter Act 1793, Charter Act 1813, Charter Act 1833, Charter Act 1853, and the provincial territory was decided by East India Company during the East India Company rule. Then second era was British government rule from 1858 to 1947. Um, in this era, British Parliament introduced Act to provide good governance in Indian territory. First one was Government of India Act 1858, then Indian Council Act 1861, then Indian Council Act 1892, then Indian Council Act 1909, then Government of India Act 1915, then Government of India Act 1919, then Simon Commission 1927, Government of India Act 1935, and then India Independence Act 1947. During the British government rule, which last roughly for 100 years, provincial territory was decided by Viceroy. Uh, Before going into detail about different act, let's see the governance structure in British Indian territory. There was rule of East India Company and then British government rule. So we will see what is the governance structure in India during the East India Company rule and British government rule. During the East India Company rule, there was crown in Britain, and then there was British Parliament. In British Parliament, there was Board of Control introduced in 1784. Then there was private company, East India Company, and in company there was Court of Director. And in India, the Court of Director used to appoint Governor General, and to support the Governor General, there was two kind of councils. One is Executive Council. Executive Council was appointed by East India Company. Member of Executive Councils were appointed by East India Company. Then second one is Legislative Council. Legislative Council was introduced by Act 1853, and it was appointed by officers in India, mainly by Governor General and other officers. Then under Governor General, there was governor in different presidency, and to support the governor, there was Executive Council appointed by East India Company. Then during the British government rule in Indian territory, there was crown in Britain, then British Parliament, and under British Parliament there was Secretary of State, which got appointed in 1858, and under Secretary of State there was Governor General appointed by British Parliament. Then And to support the Governor General, there was Executive Council and Legislative Council. The member of executive councils were appointed by British government, and in 1935, diarchy was introduced in executive council. Diarchy means some member of executive councils were appointed by British government, and some members of the councils were appointed by or elected by Indian citizens. Then second council is Legislative Council. It was introduced by Indian Council Act 1861, and the member of the Legislative Councils were appointed by officers in India. Then under Governor General, there was governor in different presidency. So and to assist the governor, there was Executive Council and Legislative Council. Again, the Executive Council members were appointed by British government, and in 1919, diarchy was introduced in uh, Provincial Executive Council, and there was Legislative Council which was introduced in 1861, and again they were appointed by officers in India. So let's start the first act introduced by British Parliament, that is Regulating Act 1773. East India Company established factories at Masulipatnam in 1611 and at Surat from 1608 to 1613. Later, they start making forts at different places under the control of governor. So there are two terms. One is factory and another one is fort. In factory, basically there was building where they used to uh, store the commodities, but in fort there was guard and other stuff. So there was governor for each fort. So the three important fort of East India Company by 1773 was Fort St. George at Chennai or Madras. It was built in 1639, and it was first fort of East India Company. Then Casa da Orta or Bombay Castle built in 1666. Then Fort William at Calcutta built in 1696. In 1773, East India Company had control over the small region in Bombay and Madras. Basically, the area covered by fort was only that area was controlled by British by East India Company. But in Bengal region, they had control over large area, Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha region. In 1772, the East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy because of the loss of tea cells to America, and at that time, East India Company asked for a £1 million loan from British government. This led to the investigation of company working in India by British government. The British government was surprised by the East India Company because they found that company employees were getting rich, but company is getting bankrupt. So British government start investigation. The investigation exposed the corruption and nepotism in East India Company. And to reduce the corruption and improve the financial condition of East India Company, the British Parliament under Prime Minister Lord North passed Regulating Act 1773. This was the first time the British government tried to regulate the company affairs in India, but this act did not have any provision regarding Indian people. So, what was the act? We will see. Um, the act was limited the tenure of court of directors to 4 year, and also limited the dividends, that the profit that directors will earn from company. uh, it also guided to submit the report on civil and military expenditure by court of directors to British government. Then it prohibited companies employee from engaging in private trade and accepting bribes. And for accountability to British Parliament, centralization was done by changing the governor post of Bengal region to Governor General of Bengal. The governor of Fort St. George, Madras, and governor of Bombay, Fort, become subordinate to Governor General of Bengal. And the first Governor General of Bengal was Warren Hastings. To support the Governor General, a council of four members was established, and it was executive council. And decision was taken by majority vote, no veto power of Governor General of Bengal. Also, this act established a Supreme Court at Fort William, Calcutta in 1774, and this court was for British subjects mainly. The composition of the Supreme Court was Chief Justice and three more judges, and all these judges were British judge, and the first Chief Justice was Elijah Impey. The political and administrative by this act, Regulating Act 1773, the political and administrative function of the company were recognized for the first time. Thus, it put an end to the arbitrary rule of East India Company in India, in Indian territory. East India Company rule, second act, Act of Settlement or Declaratory Act 1781. This act was introduced by British Parliament, and this was an amendment act passed by British Parliament to amend the provision of Regulating Act 1773. The Amendment Act was passed to demarcate the boundary of the Supreme Court and Governor General Council. This act limited the power of the Supreme Court. Under the Regulating Act 1773, company servants were under dual jurisdiction. One is Supreme Court jurisdiction, and another one is Governor General jurisdiction. Through this act, the company servants were put in control of Governor General only. So this act exempted company servants from Supreme Court scrutiny for any action done in their official capacity. And this act also exempted revenue collectors and jamidars. So a separate court established by company for company employee, and appeals from the provincial court will be dealt with by Governor General Council or Executive Council. The 1781 Act restricted the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to the Calcutta region. Then third act, it was East India Company rule, Pitt's India Act 1784. The Pitt's India Act 1784 was introduced during the reign of British Prime Minister William Pitt. So that's why it was named Pitt's India Act 1784. It was passed by British Parliament to address the shortcoming of Regulating Act 1773. While Regulating Act 1773 recognized the commercial and political function of East India Company, it was it was Pitt's India Act 1784 that demarcated the political and commercial function of the company by introducing dual control. For commercial function or commercial affair, it introduced court of director, basically company directors, and for political affairs or political function, it introduced board of control. And board of control was six British parliamentarians. The and it was part of British Parliament. The board of control had power to supervise the company operation and revenue. For the first time, the term British possession in India was used for Indian territory, as Board of Control was part of British government. So, as Board of Control start supervising the Court of Director, and East India Company was ruling Indian territory. So because of Board of Control, the Indian territory was came to known as British possession in India. The British government got complete control over the company's affair and indirect control over Indian territory. Number of Governor General Council member decreased from 4 to 3, with casting vote power to Governor General, and Governor Council in province were modified on the lines of Governor General Council. To stop corruption, civil and military officers were required to disclose their property. There was no clear demarcation of government or board of control and company role or court of director. So there was two body, one is court of director and another one is board of control. But what was the exact role of these two bodies is not demarcated in Pitt's India Act 1784. And the Governor General of Bengal was accountable to both Court of Director and board of control. So he was responsible to both government and company. The next act is Act of 1786. The act was passed by British Parliament during the Prime Minister of Pitt, and it was passed to convince Cornwallis to accept the post of Governor General of Bengal. In this act, the post of Governor General of Bengal and Commander in Chief were merged. Earlier, Commander in Chief was separate post, and Commander in Chief was a part of Governor General Council member. Governor General got the power to override the decision of his council in extraordinary situations, or basically, he got the veto power. Due to these powers granted by Act of 1786, Lord Cornwallis introduced various reforms in India. He organized the civil service. He abolished Faujdari Court, and he introduced Circuit Court at Calcutta, Dhaka, Murshidabad, and Patna. And he also introduced Cornwallis Code. In Cornwallis Code, he gave the separation of revenue and justice administration. Then the principle of sovereignty of law was established. European subjects were also brought under court jurisdiction. Government officials were answerable to civil court for action done in their official capacity. So this was part of Cornwallis Code. Then there was another Governor General. It was William Bentinck, who ruled from 1828 to 1835. He abolished the circuit code established by Cornwallis, and he replaced Persian language with English language as official language of court. So he also allowed use of vernacular language by suitors at court, and for convenience of United Province or Uttar Pradesh, he established a Sadar Diwani and Sadar Nijamat Adalat at Allahabad. There was Sadar Nijamat Adalat at different places, but at Allahabad it was established by William Bentinck. Next act was Charter Act 1793. The act granted monopoly to East India Company to trade with India for next 20 years. So the British Parliament granted right to East India Company to trade with India for another next 20 years. As per the act, gain of sovereignty by crown subject is on behalf of the crown and not in its own right. This implies that the company's political activities were carried out on behalf of the British government. The company's dividend were permitted to be increased to 10%. In Regulating Act 1773, it was limited the dividend to the Court of Director to 6% only. Provision of royal approval for appointment of Governor General, the governors, and the Commander in Chief. Um, they were appointed by Board of Directors, but they need the royal permission to appoint these appointment at these posts. Granted power to Governor General for appointing Vice President from Governor General Council in case of his absence in Bengal region. When the Governor General was present in Madras or Bombay, he would supersede in authority over the governors of Madras and Bombay. Commander in Chief can be appointed from outside the Governor General Council by Board of Directors. Change in composition of Board of Control. In Pitt's India Act, there was Board of Control established with six British Parliament, but in Charter Act 1793, there was a change in composition of Board of Control. Now only three members will be part of Board of Control. One is President and two other members. Salary of the staff of Board of Control were charged to the company, and 5 lakh pound annual payment to the British government from Indian revenue was a provision of Charter Act 1793. It authorized company to grant license to individual and company employee to trade in India, known as privilege or country trade. Earlier, by Regulating Act 1773, it barred companies employee from private trade. The privilege trade resulted in opium trade to China. Senior executive of the company were prohibited from leaving India without permission. This act separated the revenue administration and judicial function of the company, leading to the disappearance of Mal Adalat or Revenue courts set up by Cornwallis. Next act was Charter Act 1813. This act extended the company rule in India for next 20 years, but the act ended the company's monopoly in trade except for tea trade in India and trade with China, thus opened the door of trade in India for other British traders. The power of the provincial government and court in India over British subjects were also strengthened by this act. The act allowed 1 lakh rupee annually for the improvement of literary and scientific knowledge, and this act also permitted Christian missionaries to propagate English and Christian religion in India. Next act was Charter Act 1833. The act was also known by the Government of India Act 1833 or St. Helena Act 1833 because by this act the control of the island of St. Helena is transferred from East India Company to Crown, and the St. Helena Island is island in South Atlantic Ocean region. The act extended the royal charter granted to East India Company for next 20 years, but ended the monopoly of tea trade in India and trade with China. Thus, East India Company became a more administrative body by this act. Governor General of Bengal became Governor General of India, and the first Governor General of India was William Bentinck, with exclusive legislative power to Governor General of Indian Council or Indian Council or simply Indian Council. The Bombay and Madras presidency lost their legislative power, but the Bombay and Madras presidency lost their legislative power, but the court of directors had veto power for any law made by the Governor General of India. Fourth member law member was introduced in Indian Council by but without any power to vote, and it was Macaulay. Law made by Governor General Council. It was regulation prior to 1833. Basically, whatever laws made by Governor General Council were known as regulation if it was enacted prior to 1833. And after 1833, the exclusive right to legislate was granted to Governor General of India Council. And after 1833, the law made by Governor General Council was known as Act. Governor General of India got complete control of civil and military affairs. The Act permitted the English to settle freely in India, colonization in India. The Act removed restriction as to religion, color, caste, and creed, and provided for free participation of Indians in the administration of country. It has made merit the only criteria for the selection. The act was repealed by Government of India Act 1915 except provision of St. Helena. Indian Slavery Act 1843 or Act 5 of 1843. It banned slavery in India. In 1833, British Parliament introduced a separate act banned slavery in British territories, including overseas territories directly under Crown control or Crown rule. But it did not ban slavery in East India Company governed territory. So, it was banned in India by Indian Slavery Act 1843 or Act 5 of 1843. And after this act, there was no real change. It only result change of slave into indentured laborers. Next act was Charter Act 1853. The act renewed the charter of East India Company without any mention of time period. The law member of Governor General Council became a full member with the right to vote. For the first time, the legislative and executive function of the Governor General Council was separated. Executive Council has had 4 members, and Legislative Council had 6 members. Four were appointed by Government of Bombay, Madras, Bengal, and Agra. But the executive had the right to veto the bill passed by Legislative Council. provision for separate governor for Bengal region, and it was different from Governor General of India. The strength of Court of Director reduced from 24 to 18. Um, 6 to be nominated by Crown. Out of 18, 6 to be nominated by Crown. The Court of Directors were empowered to constitute a new presidency and to alter the boundary of existing presidency. Although Charter Act 1833 talked about no discrimination between India and Britishers for administrative post of company, the open competition started by Charter Act 1853. The appointment to higher post by competition and not by court of director. The Macaulay Committee 1854 was formed for Indian civil services. So in this page, you will find the compilation of a different act introduced by British Parliament. The first one was Regulating Act 1773. It recognized the commercial and political function of East India Company, and it limited the tenure and dividend of Court of Directors, and uh, put a provision of to report submission by Court of Director to British Parliament. It also banned on private trade and bribe, and Governor of Bengal was changed. The post of Governor of Bengal was changed to Governor General of Bengal, and and it established Governor General Executive Council with 4 members, and gave the provision of Supreme Court at Fort William. Next act was Settlement Act in 1781. It limited the power of Supreme Court, demarcated boundary between the Supreme Court and Governor General Council. It also restricted Supreme Court jurisdiction to Bengal region, and established the Governor General Council as appeal court of provincial court. It exempted company employees from Supreme Court jurisdiction uh, for their work done in their official capacity. The next is the next one was Pitt's Act 1784. It demarcated the boundary between commercial and political function, and it established Court of Director for commercial affairs and Board of Control for political affairs. And the member of Board of Control were British parliamentarians. Then this act mentions Indian territory as British possession in India, and Pitt's India Act reduced the Governor General Council member from 4 to 3. Next act was Act of 1786. It was under this act there was merger of Governor General of Bengal region post and Commander in Chief post, and it granted veto power to Governor General of Bengal. Next act was Charter Act 1793. Under this act, royal approval for appointment of governors and board of control was reduced from 6 to 3 members, and salary from and the salary of board of control will be given by Indian revenue. And under this act, company got power to grant license to individual for trading in India. The next act was Charter Act 1813. It ended company monopoly except tea trade in India and trade with China. And this act granted 1 lakh rupee for education and allowed Christian missionaries to visit India. The next act was Charter Act 1833. Under this act, control of St. Helena was transferred to British government, and this act ended the monopoly of East India Company. And Bombay and Madras Presidency lost their legislative power under this act. The fourth law member was added to Governor General Council without voting power, and it permitted Britishers to freely settle in India. Then next was Charter Act 1853. Under that act, the fourth law member, become full member of Governor General Executive Council, and Under Charter Act 1853, uh, Legislative Council was introduced for first time in India. So this is the end of lecture. Thank you.